So like Jim said, I'm here to talk to y'all about Esther. And Esther is, the book of Esther is 10 chapters, which last week Jim talked about Ezra. And he said at the beginning, it's a short book, it's only 10 chapters. And I remember thinking, like, that's not very short. Like, it's very long, or it's long to do in 1 week anyway. So we could do a whole series on Esther, I feel like, but we're going to do it in 1 day. So I hope that I won't keep you forever. I'm going to try to go as quickly and concisely as possible while still sharing with you what I learned this week in Esther. Real quick before we start, though, today is September 27th, so when Jim asked me to preach, I specifically asked for today because today is my mom's birthday. So if you're on the Facebook chat, could you just wish my mom a happy birthday? She's watching us right now, and her name is Lauren Johnston. Just tell her that happy birthday from our City Church family. Let her know that we love her and that she's great. So there you go. There's my little spiel for the beginning. So we're in the book of Esther today. We're going to be going through the story, the narrative of Esther. Esther is a narrative, so it's a story. We're going to have a story time today. But before we get there, I wanted to tell you about the context. Context is really important to me. I think it's important to know the who, what, where, when, and why of a story before we get into it. So I'm going to tell you guys about where Esther takes place, when Esther takes place, and the main characters. If we were in a literary class, this would be the setting. So if we were in school, that's what we would be talking about. I heard one person laugh at that, thank you. So the where of this is the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire is this huge empire, and this specifically takes place in the capital city of Susa. So it's a citadel, which means it's a fortified city, and the whole story takes place inside the city. This took place around 479 BC, so this was about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. So putting it in context of the other books of the Bible that we've been studying, a couple weeks ago we finished up a series on Daniel. Daniel was during the Babylonian exile when the Jews were taken out of Jerusalem. And the same thing was happening in Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel also all mentioned this exile. So King Cyrus had allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And a lot of them stayed in Persia. So Persia is a really diverse empire. So you're going to see there's going to be a lot of Jewish people still in Persia once we get into the story. It's a really ethnically diverse place. This book of Esther happens in between chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 10 of Ezra. So last week when Pastor Jim was talking about the book of Ezra, he said there's an 80-year gap in between chapter 6 and 7 of Ezra. That's where Esther happens. So there's some context about what's going on biblically around this time. And then the who. So what's going on with who we have? We've got 4 main people in this story. We've got Esther, obviously because it's named the book of Esther, right? So Esther is a young Jewish girl. We don't really know how old she is because we don't know what the marrying age was during this time, but we can probably guess she was a young teenage girl, and she's a Jewish girl. We have Mordecai, who is her cousin. Esther is an orphan, so Mordecai has adopted her, and he is raising her, and he is from the tribe of Benjamin in Israel. And then we have the king. This king, Ahasuerus, they call him Ahasuerus in the text, but it's actually King Xerxes I, who's the grandson of King Cyrus, who is the one who led the Jews back to Jerusalem. So I know I'm just fire hosing information at you. I'm sorry. I really want to get this information through in the time that we have. So apologies. But the king, I want to pause a minute and talk about Xerxes because this guy was not a great guy. If you were here last week and you heard Pastor Jim talking about Ezra, you heard the story of King Xerxes splitting his best friend's son in half and commanding his army to march across him because his best friend had the audacity to ask hey, can my son be released from the war to come take care of me? How could he? So Xerxes is like really not a great guy. This is the same guy, if you're familiar with history, the 300 Spartan War from Greek history, they were fighting against Xerxes' army. So the movie 300 is like very, very, very loosely based upon that story in history. So that's the Xerxes that we're talking about. It's this really like vile, cruel man. And then we've got Haman. Haman is an Agagite. And I want to pause here a minute and tell you what that means. Because in chapter 3 of Esther, it tells us that Haman's an Agagite, and then that's it. That's all it tells us. And we don't really get a lot of context for what this means. But it's actually really important to know, like, the history between the Agagite people and the Hebrew people and how that relates to Haman and Mordecai's relationship. So I'm going to take you back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 7. And what's happening here is Saul is the king of Israel at this time. He was the first king of Israel. And God commanded Saul to defeat the Amalekite people. And he said, you need to completely defeat everyone. You need to annihilate the Amalekite people. So we're going to pick up right here in verse 7. It says, and Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. Verse 8, and he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. So he killed everyone, but he took Agag. Verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen, and of the fattened calves and of the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. So Saul halfway obeyed, right? He kind of listened, and he spared Agag. And Agag, notice that looks like Agagite. He is the ancestor of Haman. So there's this underlining tension between the Hebrew people and the Agagite people. And this informs a lot of the way that Mordecai and Haman are going to interact in chapters 3, 4, and 5. So when we see them, they know who they are, they know their ethnicities, and they know the history of their people. So when they interact together, that's going to inform how they speak to each other and how they interact. Y'all tracking with me? Cool. Thanks for answering me. That was great. I think that was Christina. Or Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so one more thing I want to talk about before we dive into the story is I've been talking to a lot of people about Esther this week, and everyone kind of gets stuck on this theme of moral ambiguity in the story. No one in this story is what we would consider to be a good or righteous person as far as we know the word of God, what the Jewish people would be following. And that could cause a lot of tension for us when we're reading the story. We're why is it okay that they're making these decisions or doing these things? And I think that it makes the story more powerful for me, because even our protagonists, they don't always do things the right way, or they don't always follow the word of God the way that we would expect them to. And I think it makes it relatable, because we know that we all fall short of the glory of God, and none of us are perfect in our ways. So when we see characters in Scripture that are flawed and that are still used in God's will, I think that we can insert ourselves into the story. So I just want to acknowledge before the story begins that there are a lot of decisions that are made that are questionable, and that helps us to relate to them. So here we go. We're going to start in Esther chapter 1, verse 1. So we're going to start with, now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia in over 127 provinces. So huge empire, right? Verse 2. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. Verse 4. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So he had a party for 6 months. That's how the story begins. King Xerxes just threw a party for his whole empire just to show how great he was, right? And then at the end of that 6 months, he throws a smaller party in his palace. It says in verse 5, and when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And this wasn't just a feast. This was a drunken, rager that was full of debauchery. And there are a lot of children present, so I'm not going to fully go into what was happening here, but I think that our adult minds can kind of make the leap. But there was, this was not a, what we would consider to be a dinner party that was happening here. So this lasts for 7 days, right, in the palace of the court. And then we're going to skip down to verse 10. The king makes a request. He said, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagatha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. Verse 11, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So, the king had a party, this huge blowout party for 7 days. And on the 7th day, it said his heart was merry with wine, and so was all his friends. And he calls his queen to come so he can show her off, right? This is not a great situation for Queen Vashti to be entering into. And I talked earlier about moral ambiguity. Queen Vashti is the only one that we really see operating with a moral compass. And we see it here in verse 12. She says, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So Queen Vashti recognized a dangerous situation. She knew her worth. She set boundaries for herself, and then she upheld them. And I feel like there's a whole day's worth of content right there that we can talk about, right? I just breathed really heavy into my mic. Sorry about that. But the king became enraged, right? The king did not see it that way. He became enraged, and he went to all of his advisors. And he was like, this cannot stand. What do we do? So his advisors gave him counsel. And this is so important here because the people that you surround yourself with really matters. Because he did the wise thing. He was in a situation where a decision had to be made. His tensions were flying high. So he went to the wise people of the time to ask them for advice. But they didn't give him good advice, right? So the people who you go to really matters. His actions were good. The people who he asked weren't that great. So the king was enraged. He went to the wise people of his council of advisors, and they're like, you need to dethrone Vashti. We're going to write a decree that said that she's no longer allowed to enter your presence, and we're going to find a new queen and put out a decree amongst the land that says that women have to listen to what their husbands say. So that's what happened. So Vashti was dethroned. And, when you're reading this, you might start to feel some feelings for Vashti, right? You might start to feel feelings of unfairness or what have you. But I just want to bring us back for a minute and remind us that the story isn't about Vashti. And the story isn't really even about Esther. The book's called Esther. That's not about Esther. The story is about God and his plan to save the Hebrew people. God knew that there was about to be a serious threat to the Hebrew people, and he needed to put someone in the position of queen who had the ability to save them. And Vashti, while her decision may have been right, was not the person for that position. There was someone better. So she had to be dethroned so someone else could come in her stead. So now there's an opening for queen, and the counselors are working to figure out how they're going to find a new queen. And that is where we get to meet Esther, right? So we're going to skip to chapter 2, verse 5. So now there was a Jew in Susa, because remember, a lot of Hebrew people stayed in the Persian capital and the Persian Empire after they were allowed to go back. So there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So that was the tribe of Israel that he was descended from, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Verse 7. He was to bring up Hadassah, that is Esther. So Hadassah is her Hebrew name, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither a father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as her own daughter. So here, this sets the scene for us. Esther is a young, beautiful woman, and she is orphaned, and she is living with her cousin. And what's so interesting is her name is Hadassah, right? Hadassah means myrtle tree, and myrtle trees are sweet smelling because she's beautiful and lovely to look at, but they are bitter tasting. So she has a kick to her, and you're going to see that later. So we're going to come back to that at the end of the story. This continues in verse 8. So I said that they have to figure out a way to get a new queen, right? So this is where the king's advisors start to set that up. So the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. Verse 9, and the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. So Esther and all these other young women from across the empire have come into the palace to enter into this contest to become queen. And Esther is already gaining favor. Verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So she's hiding the fact that she's a Jew. She's hiding the fact that she's related to Mordecai. So when reading commentaries and devotionals about Esther, this is almost always named a beauty contest, like this thing that's happening here. What it is these teenage girls from across the land are taken into the palace, right? The king's court. And they have 12 months of preparation for 1 month with the king. So they're being given food and oils and cosmetics, and they're being prepared for 1 night with the king. And after that 1 night, if the king likes them, he's going to make them queen. And if he doesn't like them, they join his harem, and they live in his harem. So this is what they're preparing Esther for. And we see from the beginning, right, from verse 9, that Esther is winning favor. And it's not because she's doing anything special. It's not because she's out of the ordinary. We know she's a lovely woman, lovely to look at, right? And she has lots of other great characteristics. But I just want to point out that the favor that she's getting is providence from God, right? That she is being prepared for a reason. So that's verse 9. We're going to skip down to verse 10. Verses 9 through 16 explain the process of the contest, the preparation that they're going through. And in verse 17, the time comes for Esther's night with the king, and it said, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So now Esther is queen, right? So she won the contest, and she has her position as queen. So while all this is happening, Mordecai, her guardian, I guess you could say, her guardian, her person who's raising her. He's been coming to the gates of the king, and he's been like checking up on her and seeing how she's doing, but no one knows they're related. No one knows they're kin. But he's been coming to the gates, and he just like happens to hear something super important. And we see that in verse 22, chapter 2, verse 22. So in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. So this feels like super serendipitous, right? Like Esther's just chilling at the king's gates, and then he hears this plot, and he happens to be kin with the person who's queen who can tell the king. Like, that's pretty cool. And then verse 23, when the affair was investigated and found to be so, these men were both hanged at the gallows, and then it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So far we've gone through 2 chapters, and already so much has happened, right? We had like this crazy party. The queen was dethroned. A year passed. A new queen is now queen, and the new queen's secret cousin learned about a plot to kill the king and saved the king's life. This sounds like a soap opera, y'all. Like, it's a really crazy story. And then Mordecai, you would think that he would get something for like saving the king's life, but everything just, whoa, I just threw the clicker. Sorry, thanks, Caitlin. I promise I didn't break it. I actually haven't tested it yet, so I don't know. Don't worry, guys, I didn't break it. You can see that like things are being set up for a certain purpose, right? And Mordecai, nothing happened, like he didn't get any kind of reward or anything. Life just continues on as normal. And that leads us into chapter 3, where we meet Haman. So in between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, some years have passed, so it's probably like not a lot, it's probably like 3 to 4 years have passed. And that brings us to Haman. So chapter 3, verse 1. After these years, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Verse 2. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down and pay homage. I actually don't know how to pronounce that word. I looked up all the names, but I didn't look up how to pronounce that one, so sorry, guys. But here, remember the context from 1 Samuel 15, right? There's an underlying history between the Agagite people and the Hebrew people. So Haman is second in command. He's expecting everyone to bow down to him. Mordecai is a Jew, so bowing to someone who's not God would, 1, be considered idolatry, and 2, this man is an Agagite, so bowing to an Agagite is like even worse. So he's like, he's not going to bow. And in verse 5, this enrages Haman. It says that when Haman saw Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, right? And he decides, like, this cannot stand. Like, there needs to be something that happens here. So he decides, like, obviously I have to kill the whole Hebrew race. Like, all of the Hebrew people in the whole empire, Haman has to kill. So that's what he decides to do. He goes and he casts die to decide the date of slaughter for the Hebrew people in the entire empire. So not just Mordecai, not just the city of Susa, the entire empire. And we're talking a lot of people here. So we're talking a genocide. So he casts die, and the Hebrew word for die is pur, and to decide, like, this is the date that everyone, like, open fire on the Jews in Persia. And then he writes this edict from the king that says, like, on this day, anyone can go and kill the Jewish people, and you'll be paid this amount of money. And then, like, he is smart, Like, he doesn't go to the king and say, like, this guy made me mad, we need to kill him and all his people. He goes and he says this. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples and in the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different than your laws, than those of every people, and they do not keep the king's laws. So that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." So he's like, they don't follow your laws. It's not going to benefit you to have them around. So obviously, they need to go. And the king agrees with him. The king's like, yeah, you're right. Let's kill them. So the king signs the edict that Haman wrote and seals it with the signet ring, and it goes out to the entire empire, right? So now everyone in the empire knows on this certain day, on this certain month, that it's going to be okay to just go out and slaughter all of the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. You can imagine that there's just like chaos in the empire, right? In verse 15, I didn't put it in here, but in chapter 3, verse 15, it says, the city of Susa was in chaos, and Haman and Xerxes have a drink, like casual, because that's what you do when you decide to kill a whole people group. So they put this out. And then in chapter 4, we see Mordecai's reaction to it. So we're going to go to chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned that all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. So, and I highlighted tore his clothes, because if you remember 2 weeks ago when Jim McLean was up here preaching on Joel, he told us that like tearing your clothes was not like a small thing. It's not like they could just like hop on over to Target and get a new shirt. Like this was the only garment that they probably had. So if he tore it, it wouldn't have been easy to replace. So Mordecai is completely undone, right? Because he's just learned that his entire people group in his country, or in the empire that he's currently living in, are going to be killed. And Esther, even though she's in the castle, she's also, it says that she's deeply distressed and fearful, because people don't know that she's Jewish, but she does, and her people are in danger. So Mordecai and Esther have like plot. They talk through everything with each other. And Esther tells Mordecai, he's like, Mordecai tells Esther, like, you need to go to the king and you need to save our people. Like, you need to go to them and stop Haman from killing us. And Esther knows that it's illegal to go up to the king without being called, right? That's an act punishable by death. And this king is not a good guy. Like, King Xerxes is this cruel man. He's the one that ripped apart his best friend's son. So she's like, looking at her cousin saying, I can't just stroll into him without being called. Like, he will actually kill me. And here's what Mordecai says in response to her. And this is like the most famous verse in Esther. So whenever you hear about Esther, this is the one that's quoted. We're going to start in verse 13. Then Mordecai told them being the eunuchs, because the eunuchs are having this conversation back and forth between Mordecai and Esther. They can't talk face to face. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this. So Mordecai tells her, he's like, you're not safe in the palace. Like, you will be destroyed as well. And God is going to accomplish his will. Like, God will deliver the Hebrew people from this plot. And the question is, are you going to be a part of it? And I think that these two questions apply to us today. Like, we are all in whatever position we're in, whether you work from home or whatever job you go to, or if you stay home with your family, you're in your position for a very specific reason. Like, you have been called to wherever you are, and your calling will always coincide with someone else's need. And if you don't step into your calling, someone else will, and the need will be filled. But do you want to be a part of God's plan? Is the question that Mordecai asks Esther. And I think that's the question that this story is asking us today. Like, do you want to be a part of the plan that God has for your life? And I know I do. But then Mordecai makes another really good point with I got stuck. Mordecai makes another really good point in verse 17 that I want to point out. He said that if you don't step into your calling, someone else will. Deliverance will come, but you and your father's house will perish. There are consequences if we don't step into our calling. So it's not like we could just say no, thanks God, I'm good. So he's saying, do you want to be a part of it? If you don't, there will still be a consequence for you, but you have the opportunity to make a difference. And Esther listens. In verse 15, she said, Esther told them, the eunuchs, to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do, and then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So here we see Esther displaying the bravery that she's known for, right? She knows that it's against the law. She knows that she'll probably die when she walks in to see the king. But what I want you to notice is her actions. She's displaying bravery, but before she displays that bravery, she gathers her community and she asks them to fast for her. And then she fasts with her women. This is the difference between her counsel and the counsel of the king and of Haman. Haman and the king also go seek counsel when they have a big decision, when they are feeling fear, when they're feeling anxiety, when their tensions are raised. But the counsel that they seek isn't godly. When you're looking at Esther, the counsel that she seeks is she's saying, I need you to fast on my behalf. And I hope that you have people who will pray and fast on your behalf and who will intercede for you when you are in a situation where you need it. So Esther goes to her community. She's like, yo, grab all of the Jews, let's all fast, and then I will go to the king. And because of this fasting, she had providence on her. And providence, I read somewhere this week, these aren't my words, so I'm not that, I stole this from someone. But providence negates the absence of luck. I was reading about this next verse. So because they all fasted, she had God's providence of her, and she didn't need to anyone to be oh, good luck. Have fun with that, with entering the king's presence. So now we're entering into chapter 5, verse 2. And this is where she walks into the king. And it says, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So once again, providence. He found favor, or she found favor in his sight. And this is so out of character for Xerxes. Remember, this is a cruel and vile man. He had within his legal right to kill her on the spot. And we know that he has no qualms about killing people. So he could have killed her, but he didn't. And then he took it one step further. Not only did he not kill her, which is a really low bar, but for this guy, it's not. Not only did he not kill her, but he was like, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom. Is that what that says? Even to the half of my kingdom. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And he repeats this question to her 3 times over the next 2 chapters. So not only did he not kill her, but he's like, I'll give you whatever you want. Whatever you ask for, you can have it. And this is the most out of character thing that we see Xerxes do in this entire book. And Esther is smart, right? She doesn't be like, I need you to take care of Haman. She's like, I want you to have a banquet, and I want you to invite Haman to it. And the first time when I read this, for the first time when I knew I was going to be preaching on it. I hadn't read it in a couple years. And I remember getting to that part and being like, that's what you asked for? Like, you want a dinner? We're like, okay. So she goes to the banquet, right? And Haman is like so excited, right? He's like, oh, the queen invited me to dinner. And so he comes to dinner with the queen and king, and she doesn't say anything. She just has dinner with him. And then the king presents the same question to her, like, what do you want? I'll give you anything, even to the end of like half of my kingdom. And again, she's like, I want you to throw another banquet tomorrow and invite Haman back to it tomorrow. So Haman's sitting here thinking, like, I am the best. Like, he leaves this first banquet thinking like he is at the top of his game and he's in high spirits. And then we see him fall from grace. Chapter 5, verse 9. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. So he leaves this banquet, like all excited, and then he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai won't bow to him. And he's immediately just like furious, right? So he goes home. And once again, who you surround yourself with matters. He goes home and he asks his wife and his like counsel, his best friends, for advice. And they're like, you should kill Mordecai. And Haman's like, that's a great idea. I should do that. So Haman builds this 75-foot pole in his backyard, and he plans to go to the king the next morning and ask him for permission to execute Mordecai, because he's so enraged that Mordecai refuses to bow to him. Now, chapter 6. This is the turning point of the whole book, right? So at the same exact time that this conversation is happening, where Haman's asking his wife and his advisors, like, what should I do about Mordecai? This dude won't bow to me. And his wife and advisors are giving his advice. The king is suffering from insomnia and just like can't sleep. So in chapter 6, verse 1, it said, on that night the king could not sleep. So he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And what story do they happen to read the king? But it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's young men attended him, said, nothing has been done for him. So like across the city, Haman is planning Mordecai's execution, and in the palace, the king is hearing about how Mordecai just saved his life and being like, what do we do for him? And his attendants are like, nothing? So the next morning, they're in the courts, and Haman comes in, and Haman's like still feeling all high from the banquet invites that he has, and he's walking up to the king, and he's about to ask, like, hey, I want to execute this man. Let me execute this man. And before he can say that, the king asks him this question. He goes, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And then he went through this extravagant description, you should give him the royal garment and put him on a horse and lead him through the whole city while someone stands in front of him and declares this is the man that the king delights to honor. And the king's like, great idea, go get Mordecai and do that. And I wish I could see Haman's face when that happened, right? So Mordecai does this. And this scene in this book reveals to us the theme of the entire book. This book is a book of reversals. There are a bunch of ironic reversals that happen throughout the book where we think one thing's going to happen and then it switches on us, right? And it shows us the underlying theme. So I'm going to run through a couple of them right here. First, an orphan becomes the queen, right? So there's a big switch. Second, Vashti refused to come when she was called, and she was dethroned for it. Esther came when she wasn't called, and she was given whatever she wanted. She was offered anything that she wanted. Mordecai was honored instead of Haman. We just saw that in chapter 6. Also in chapter 6, Mordecai's sackcloth is replaced with royal garments. And moving forward, there are going to be two more big reversals that we see in chapter 7. I don't want to spoil them, so I'm going to go over them later. But the rest of this book is a reversal. Everything that happens, every event that happens in chapters 1 through 5 is now going to happen in reverse order in chapters 7 through 10. And the writer did this very intentionally to make a huge point, and I'm going to tell it to you at the end. So that's a little in-person clickbait for you. So there was a banquet in chapter 5, right? Now we have the next banquet in chapter 7. Now this is where Esther tells the king, reveals her identity as a Jew, reveals that she is related to Mordecai, and says that Haman's who he is. And I'm going to let her say it because she says it better than me. So this is Esther speaking in chapter 7, verse 4. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Continuing in verse 5, then King Ahasuerus said to the Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Queen Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. And then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen, and the king was enraged, and he stormed out of the banquet, right? And Haman is now realizing, oh, this is bad news. So he threw himself to the queen, and he's pleading for her forgiveness. And the king walks back in and sees him thrown on top of the queen. And then he's even more mad. He's like, how could you do this to my queen and in my house? After she just because he assumed that he was attacking her. And a eunuch pipes up in verse 9 and says, Haman just built a pole to execute Mordecai last night in his house, in his backyard. And so the king's great. So they hanged Haman on the gallows. It says hanged on the gallows, but it was actually a pole that he prepared for Mordecai, and then the wrath of the king abated. So now Haman has been executed, and this is our next big reversal. Haman was expected to be honored at the banquet, and instead he was executed. And the final ironic reversal was Haman was executed on the pole that he planned to use for Mordecai. So now, Haman's dead, but his decree is still in effect. It's not like we can just easily pull back, right? He can't just delete the tweet. It's out, right? It is in all of the providences and all 127 regions, and on a certain day in a certain month, everyone's going to annihilate the Jewish people. So in chapter 4, Mordecai and Esther had to plot before Esther went to the king. And now in chapter 8, Mordecai and Esther are once again plotting to figure out, what do we do about this day that's coming? In chapter 3, we saw Haman elevated to second in command. Now in chapter 8, Esther elevates Mordecai to second in command. In chapter 3, Haman wrote a decree to annihilate the Hebrew people. Now in chapter 8, Mordecai is writing a decree. And we're going to go, chapter 8. I thought it was chapter 9, but I was mistaken. Chapter 8, Mordecai writes his own decree, and we're going to go ahead and check out what that is, starting in verse 9. And an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded, concerning the Jews. We're going to skip to verse 11. Saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. So Mordecai and Esther, after they plot, they figure out the only way to counteract this incoming battle that's coming against the Jews is to send out a counter decree that says the Jewish people can defend themselves. But they didn't stop there. They said they can defend themselves, they can plunder the goods of the people, and then they can take vengeance. And I just want to point out that over and over and over again in God's word, he says that vengeance is for the Lord. Like, it's not our place to take vengeance in his stead. And this decree is the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar to the one that Haman made. And this is where we get the moral ambiguity coming in Mordecai. So it can make us feel a little bit of tension and make us a little confused. Esther also has her moment in chapter 9, verse 13, where she has all of 10 Haman's sons publicly executed. Remember I said that myrtle tree means bitter tasting? That's where that comes out. So the day of the battle comes in chapter 9, and the Jewish people have victory over the people that are coming to annihilate them, right? And they fight against the people who are coming to slaughter them, and the Hebrew people are not annihilated in the Persian Empire. So Mordecai and Esther create this holiday called Purim. Purim is still celebrated by the Jewish faith today, and it's a celebration of the fact that the Hebrew people survived Haman's plot to kill them, right? And remember I said that Haman cast die to choose the day that this battle would take place? The die is called Pur in Hebrew. That's where you get the word Purim. I thought that was interesting, so I thought I'd tell you. So now the story ends with the entire empire having this festival of Purim, this party to celebrate the fact that the Hebrew people were not annihilated. Do y'all remember how chapter 1 opened up in verses 1 through 5 with a big party, right? So everything that happens in Everything that happens in chapter 1 through 5 happens in reverse order in chapter 7 through 10. And the writer did this super intentionally, right? All of the events that happen to put the Jews in danger. And then in chapter 6, there's a reversal. The tables turn. And then everything that happens after it are the same events happening in reverse order, and it's righting the situation. And this story, or the writer did this to point us to the greatest reversal in the story of the Bible, because the Bible is one story, right? This is just one little chapter of the greater Bible story. But this story is all about a God that goes through great lengths to fix brokenness and to reconcile his people, right? To save his people. And it's about a kingdom that's plagued with like these really dark diseases, like genocide, like people who are in positions of power who are abusing them, like racism, like prejudice. And it's people who are in all these real hard things that are being saved by an unlikely character in Esther and Mordecai. And these things, the story, points us to a God that goes through all these lengths to write the story, and points us to Jesus, which is the greatest reversal, a God who came down to step in our place and take our place for us, right? So this whole story was trying to tell us that God works for us, even though God's name isn't mentioned a single time in the whole story. If you notice at the beginning when I was going through the characters, God wasn't in it. No one mentions God's name. No one prays. God doesn't speak. There are no miracles that happen. It's not like no one talks about God. They talk about Jews, and we know the Jewish faith, but no one ever references the Jewish God. And the closest that they get is in chapter 4, verse 14, where it says, Mordecai speaking, and he tells Esther, deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but it doesn't say where that deliverance is coming from. It doesn't say who is providing it. And then Esther replies to him, and she's saying, go and fast, but it doesn't say why you're fasting or what fasting does. It doesn't say pray and fast. So there's no reference to God, his provision, or his faithfulness anywhere in the story, right? And in hindsight, it's so easy to see where he was, right? It's easy to see, like, the king's insomnia at the same time that Haman was planning Mordecai's death, like hearing about the, oops, I just hit the thing when I was moving my hands. Hearing about, like, the story of Mordecai saving his life, Mordecai's eavesdropping and being able to save the life in the first place, Esther and all of the favor that she didn't actually deserve, and Vashti's, like, being deposed. Like, you can see how God's working through it. But in the moment, it doesn't feel like that, right? And I think that a lot of us might be in situations today where it doesn't feel like God is working, and it doesn't feel like he is moving in our situation. And I just want to, like, encourage you today that if you are in your own personal Susa, if you have a Haman that is coming for you, that, like, our inability to recognize or to see God working in our life does not mean that he is absent. It does not mean that he is not there. God was never mentioned in the story. It seems like he wasn't present. But when we look back, we can see his hand at work. We know that he sent Esther. We know that he sent Mordecai. We know that he orchestrated this whole thing, right? And you might be in a place, in a season, where God is seemingly silent. And you don't know if you have an Esther or Mordecai on your horizon who are coming for you to intervene on your behalf. Or you might be the Esther or Mordecai who are intervening on someone else's behalf. Your calling might coincide with someone else's need, and you might just need to step into that in order to show up for someone else. So today, I just hope that you hear the encouragement behind the story. The story is hard. It doesn't shy away from hard topics, right? It is hard to read some of the decisions that are made, and it acknowledges that there is real cruelty in the world. But it also shows us hope, and it shows us that there's a God who's working throughout it, and the God that cares for us, and reminds us that we are not forgotten. So today, I hope that you hear the encouragement in it. I hope that you hear about a God that works through whatever situation you're in, even if it feels like he's not. And I hope that you can, feel God's presence, even when it feels like he's silent. So I'd like to pray for us before we close. Father, thank you for the opportunities that you give us. I pray that you open our eyes for whatever group of people that are in here today or watching online. I pray that you open the eyes of the person who is in a season of hardship, that they can see you working and see and feel your presence when it feels like you're not there. I pray for the person who has a calling that they are about to step into. I pray for courage and for the momentum to step forward, Lord. And I pray for the person that doesn't know you. I pray that just your presence would overwhelm them, and that they would be able to experience the joy and the love that you have for them, and that they would be able to see all that you've done and all that you are doing to fight for them. God, I pray that you help us out we go throughout our week, and that you help us to see you more and to acknowledge your presence. And we pray all these things in your son Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Go change your world.